the military situation in Ukraine. A major part of the propaganda and disinformation perpetuated by the Western media and the Ukrainian government is to portray the Russian military as somehow, on one hand, extremely ineffective, and on the other hand, extremely brutal. This is completely false, as if we look into the facts of what's actually taking place on the ground in Ukraine. The Russian military has been both extremely effective in its military operation and extremely cautious to prevent damage to infrastructure and the civilian population in Ukraine. In this disinformation campaign perpetrated by the Western media and Ukrainian government, there have been numerous stories, hilarious stories that have come out to be false, trying to play up the supposed heroism of the Ukrainian government and the supposed ineffectiveness and supposed weakness of the Russian military. I mean, that idea, even in itself, should be pretty laughable. These people want to convince themselves that somehow the Russian military is a weak force. I think that's a pretty funny claim. One of the first cases that comes to mind is the Snake Island issue, where the Western media, the Ukrainian government and the Western media portrayed it as if this island controlled by Ukrainian forces was engaged by Russian forces, and the Russian forces told them to surrender, and the Ukrainian forces made this statement cursing at them, and they were supposedly all killed by the Russian forces, and this was a big story of the supposed heroism of the Ukrainian side. And Zelensky awarded posthumously these Ukrainian soldiers, gave them awards posthumously, claiming that they had all been killed by Russian forces. But that came out to be completely false. What actually happened was that the Ukrainian forces all surrendered to the Russian military, and they were all alive. And pretty bad that the Ukrainian government claimed that these soldiers were all dead. I'm sure their families were not too happy to hear that, when in fact they were alive and well. They had all surrendered to Russian forces. Of course, that's not as heroic sounding for the Western press to show Western audiences. And then there's the hilarious story of the supposed ghost of Kiev, which turned out to be false. And on social media, you saw these videos from claiming to be the ghost of Kiev that actually turned out to be from video games. Another story that was completely made up. And then on top of that, you have loads of fake videos of supposed Russian prisoners of war that have been spread on social media by the Ukrainian government. And some cases there have been these supposed Russian prisoners of war have actually been identified as actually Ukrainian soldiers from other photographs of these Ukrainian soldiers, them just wearing Russian uniforms, claiming to be prisoners of war. So many fake videos of this, pictures of this. The purpose of all of this, the Snake Island myth, the Ghost of Kiev myth, these videos, these fake videos of Russian prisoners of war, the purpose of this is to play up in the Western press this supposed story of that the Ukrainians are fighting to the last to defend, and that they don't want Russia, and that they're bravely fighting, and that's to whip up this idea that the West has to do something to give more support to the Ukrainian forces. Never mind that the Ukrainian forces are already fully backed by the West. They've been filled for the past 8 years with NATO and Western and U.S. Weaponry, and they're using this to try and play this up as, oh, the heroic Ukrainians are fighting against this massive Russian force, and this small Ukraine is standing up to this massive giant Russia, and they're giving Russia a bloody nose. This is completely false. Russia has been moving extremely effectively. And if this was the case, it wouldn't have to make this stuff up. But just looking at the facts on the ground, some may point out, why is the Russian military, why haven't they taken all of Ukraine yet? Well, if you look at how long it took for the United States to occupy Iraq, for example, it took a significant amount of time, longer than Russia has been engaging in this special military operation in Ukraine. And mind you, Iraq at that point had been severely weakened with a decade of sanctions, and still it took a long time comparatively to what's going on in Ukraine at this point. There's also the fact that Russia's operation is moving slowly, deliberately, to try and prevent civilian casualties. They're moving in slowly but steadily. And you can look at the map. Russia has already cleared most of the Donbas region, and has cleared, Russia controls most of the Ukrainian coast at this point, and has linked Crimea, Russian territory of Crimea, to the Donbas. So they have moved extremely effectively. They have encircled many of the most important cities. They are on the outskirts of Kiev. Now, they have not taken Kiev, and they have not taken these other cities because, again, they are deliberately moving in a way to try and reduce civilian casualties. I think anyone can understand the Russian military has extremely massive forces. If they wanted to, they could flatten these cities and take them. That's not what they want to do, because they know that if they do this, that's going to come back to bite them, because they need to have a stable Ukraine, a prosperous Ukraine. That way they'll have stability on their border in the future. They do not want to destroy the country. They view the country as part of themselves. You know, you look at Putin's statements, and just the fact Russians and Ukrainians, they see themselves as the same people. They don't see themselves as enemies, outside of course, these ultra-nationalist extremists that do exist. But the Russian government, Russian military, does not see the Ukrainian people as enemies, and they want to move very cautiously to prevent civilian casualties. Of course, that's not to say that there aren't civilian casualties. Of course, there are. And the Ukrainian military has been deliberately using human shields, especially these Ukrainian Nazi forces like the Azov battalion in Mariupol, which is surrounded and cut off at this point. The Azov battalion has been preventing civilians from escaping, shooting civilians when they try to escape, blocking them, even though Russia is trying to set up civilian humanitarian corridors for civilians to get out. Furthermore, the Ukrainian military and these neo-Nazi forces have been placing artillery and other weaponry right next to, side by side with civilian apartments, hospitals, and so on, deliberately trying to use these civilians as human shields. If you know anything about Russia's military, they have a massive, very effective, they specialize in artillery. They have massive artillery forces. And if they wanted, they could take Ukraine very easily using this massive artillery force and then moving in with tanks. Nothing would be able to stop them in doing that, no matter how much propaganda the social media in Ukraine and the Western media tries to put as the supposed heroism. Just the massive firepower that Russia could bring to bear on these cities would be unstoppable. The point is, they don't want to do that. They want to move in slowly but steadily and take apart the Ukrainian military, take apart these Nazis, and eventually come to a negotiation with the Ukrainian government if possible. Already, the Ukrainian Air Force has been pretty much wiped out. And that's why the West is considering giving airfields to Ukraine in Poland and Polish Air Force, because the Ukrainian Air Force has been pretty much wiped out at this point. And on top of that, the Ukrainian military has been already severely weakened with already what's happened so far in this Russian military operation. Because you have to remember, Ukraine's best forces, the strongest forces, most specialized forces, were in the east of the country on the border of Donbas, because they were preparing, not only because they were fighting against the Donbas for 8 years, but also they were preparing a massive military operation against the Donbas that was upset and prevented by this Russian operation. So Ukraine had its best forces in the east of the country, and they've largely been wiped out at this point. And the only thing that the Ukrainian regime can do at this point is to hunker down in the cities using civilian shields, because they know that Russia is not going to move in and wipe them out. They're going to try and surround these areas and come to a negotiation to try and get civilians out and come to some negotiation. And as far as negotiations, one of the very important aspects of that is Zelensky at this point. He is a Western puppet. He has been. The Ukrainian government is a Western puppet regime installed by the West in 2014. Could go back into all that history. Could check out Oliver Stone's documentary, Ukraine on Fire. It's absolutely undeniable. But another aspect to this is that for his own interests, for his own survival, and if he actually cares about the Ukrainian people, he should negotiate with Russia to try and put an end to this situation, because he's not going to win. You'd have to be a complete idiot to believe that somehow Ukraine can defeat Russia. It's insane. Russia at this point has used a tiny fraction of its forces. It's used between 10 to 20% of its assembled forces in the area. There's no way, and already with that small amount, Russia has massively beaten back the Ukrainian government. The Russian military came in to this operation with a major numerical disadvantage. I believe it was 1 to 7 disadvantage. Usually when you carry out an invasion or military operation of this sort, you need a 3 to 1 advantage. They had a 1 to 7 disadvantage, where they had on the opposing side, the Ukrainians had 7 times the amount of military forces that Russia had. And still, despite that, Russia really made huge moves and really debilitated the Ukrainian military, gave them a real bloody nose, and are still moving in, despite all the propaganda of supposedly Russia's losing the war. I mean, somehow they're losing the war, and they've achieved all of this with using hardly a fraction of their military potential. So there's no way Zelensky, at this point, the Ukrainian puppet government, could win. So he has to come to some negotiation. Now, the problem is, the reason why he would be cautious in doing that is because we have to remember the neo-Nazi forces within the country. If he is seen as capitulating to Russia in any way, they will kill him, and they'll blame it on Russia. So it's extremely important that Russia succeeds swiftly in wiping out the Nazi forces, the Azov Battalion, Right Sector, and the other Nazi forces in the country, because once they are taken out of the picture, these Nazis, once they're killed or captured, then Zelensky will feel more confident in being able to negotiate with Russia and therefore avoid further civilian casualties. But at this point, he knows that if he negotiates with Russia, comes to some agreement, the Nazis in the country, the far-right ultra-nationalists, will likely kill him. And of course, the Western press will say that Russia did it, of course. Now, a very important major military development happened on March 13th. Russia carried out a strike on a Ukrainian military base in the far western part of Ukraine, Lvov or Lviv, in the far western part of Ukraine by the Polish border. And this area was used by US, British, and Canadian militaries to train the Ukrainian army. And this strike killed 180 foreign fighters and destroyed a large amount of weaponry. Now, this is extremely significant because if we look at the territory that Russia has liberated at this point, it's largely in the east, around the Donbass. The Donbass is largely cleared, and around the coast and the south. Most of the coast is cleared and liberated, as well as in the northern region around Kiev. But this is a major operation and extremely significant because it's Russia demonstrating that they can reach out and eradicate any force anywhere in the territory of Ukraine as they wish. And 180 foreign fighters were killed in this, mercenaries, and extremists, white supremacists, and probably just some idiots who thought they would have fun playing soldier going over to Ukraine to do it. Well, they've been wiped out.
So for any of y'all who are wondering what is going on, alright, we were part of the Georgia National Legion, the 102nd Ukrainian Territorial Defense, okay? Our base got fucked up. The base right next to us got fucked up. Americans, British, tons of British dead, alright? They're not saying nothing. They're counting our dead as their dead. They're trying to send us to Kiev with no fucking weapons, no kit, no fucking plates. The people who are lucky enough to get weapons are only getting magazines with like 10 fucking rounds, okay? When they wanted to send us to Kiev, we said no. Our whole group, a bunch of Americans, Canadians, British. So they told us we had to get the fuck out or they were going to shoot us in the back, alright? So me, this British guy, and another American, we fucking hid in the back of an ambulance to get out. We got to the border, and it was a whole nother mess. When you get to the border, anyone who has kit, anyone who has any military shit, they're fucking pulling you out of the line and they're sending you back to the front. We got dropped off about 5 clicks from the fucking, from the border, and we walked. And we get to the border, and this humanitarian group with a bunch of ex-SF veterans from England pull us to the side and say, you need to get, like, pulled us out and fucking, like, hit us. And they were like, you need to dump all your kit. They're pulling people out, cutting up passports, sending them back. So we dumped our shit. We got, like, all of our fucking, we got in, like, Red Cross vests, and they had, like, fucking humanitarian passes to get us through the Ukrainian border. People need to stop coming here. It's a trap, and they're not letting you fucking leave. The best way to leave is like in a Vic or a car or something. People who get on by vehicle have a better chance of hiding their fucking kit in the back, doing whatever the fuck they can, but do not try to leave Ukraine on foot if you're a volunteer. It's a mess, and it's a trap, and I have multiple people who can confirm this story for me.
And this is a major signal that Russia has full control over the situation. Even though they don't have their forces there, they're able to strike anywhere from the Polish border up to where the Russian forces are. Russia can strike anywhere within the territory of Ukraine. Another hilarious case of Ukrainian government and Western media disinformation is the case of the Vasily Bykov ship, which the Vasily Bykov ship was the ship that subdued the Ukrainian forces at Snake Island. And the Ukrainian government and US media falsely claimed that this ship was sunk. Now, it turned out that that was not true. The ship was filmed returning to the Sevastopol naval base. There was a lot of stories in the Western press that this ship that had taken over the Snake Island and subdued the Ukrainian forces there had been sunk, and as a story of the heroism and the success of the Ukrainian forces and the failure of the Russian military. Well, turned out to be false. The naval ship is undamaged, returned to its naval base, and so Russia is prevailing handily in this situation. They are moving slowly but steadily, and that is part of their strategy to avoid, as best they can, civilian casualties. They have used a small fraction of the forces they have available, and they are moving slowly but steadily, and they are winning. And all of the Western propaganda to try and claim that Russia is not doing well and that the Ukrainian forces are somehow winning It's all propaganda, disinformation for the purpose of trying to play up this supposed heroism of the Ukrainian government and Zelensky. Another funny thing about Zelensky is another piece of false information is they're showing pictures of him in military gear on the front lines, supposedly going on now, as he's so heroic visiting the front lines in the face of Russian forces. Well, actually, no, that those pictures are from a year ago. It's not going on. Another fake story by the Western press. They're trying to play this up because it's in part to the Western audiences, because they want to portray it as if, look how heroic the Ukrainians are. We have to support them. We have to do everything we can to support them. We have to flood the country with more weapons. That's kind of what they're getting at here with this propaganda. And to try and say, hey, look, Russia's not so tough. We could take them on, which is an insane idea, because as you see with the military situation, Russia, if they wanted to, they could take Ukraine very easily, but their strategy is to move slowly but steadily. They've paused numerous times for negotiations and to set up humanitarian corridors to get civilians out. And so this is all completely false, debunked propaganda. And Russia's prevailing in their operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine.